Something is shifting in global food markets, and Canadian farmers are positioned at the center of it. The agricultural trade landscape that has defined North American food exports for decades is under pressure. Markets that have long depended on American corn, for animal feed, for food processing, for industrial use, are looking at their supply relationships differently. Trade conflict, tariff uncertainty, and the unpredictability of American agricultural export policy have prompted international buyers to ask a question they have not asked seriously in years. Who else can supply what we need? Canada has an answer, and that answer is backed by some of the most productive agricultural land on the planet. A federal government actively engaged in export market diversification, and a grain and oilseed sector that has been building its international reputation for quality and reliability for generations. But here is the part of this story that matters most for Canadians watching right now. This is not just a story about export volumes and commodity prices. It is a story about farm income in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Ontario. It is a story about the rural communities whose entire economic foundation rests on agricultural prosperity. It is a story about federal trade policy, agricultural support programs, and the decisions being made right now in Ottawa and in international markets that will determine whether Canada captures this moment or lets it pass. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what is happening in global corn and grain markets, what opportunity is opening for Canadian agriculture, what the federal government is actually doing to support Canadian producers in capitalizing on it, what the realistic risks and challenges look like, and what Canadians should do to stay accurately informed as this story develops. Welcome to Maple Wire. Glad you are here. Today we are breaking down the global agricultural trade shift that is creating new opportunity for Canadian grain and crop producers, the federal policy framework supporting Canadian agricultural exports, the economic stakes for farming communities across the country, and what this means for Canadian households, taxpayers, and the broader economy. We will cover who benefits, what challenges remain, what mistakes Canadians make when interpreting agricultural trade headlines, and exactly where to find verified official information. This video is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial, legal, or policy advice. Always verify directly with official Canadian government sources. All links are in the description below. Subscribe to Maple Wire if you are not already. Agricultural trade moves fast, and the downstream effects on Canadian households and food costs are real. We track these developments so you have the context you need. To understand the opportunity opening for Canadian agriculture right now, you need to understand what has changed in the global market for corn and grain, and why the change is more significant than a typical commodity price cycle. The United States is the world's largest corn producer and exporter by a substantial margin. American corn flows into global animal feed supply chains, food processing operations, ethanol production, and industrial applications across dozens of countries. This supply relationship has been stable, commercially reliable, and competitively priced for decades. International buyers in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, and in markets across the developing world have built procurement systems around the assumption that American corn will be available, affordable, and consistently delivered. That assumption is now being tested. The same trade conflict that has produced tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and automobiles has also introduced uncertainty into American agricultural export relationships. Countries that are subject to American tariffs have responded, in many cases, by imposing their own retaliatory measures on American agricultural goods, including corn and soybeans. According to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's trade analysis and publicly available international trade reporting, retaliatory tariffs on American agricultural products have been applied by trading partners responding to American trade actions. These retaliatory measures make American corn more expensive in affected markets and create commercial incentive for buyers to explore alternative sources. At the same time, broader concerns about supply chain concentration, accelerated by the disruptions of recent years, have prompted international food security planners and commercial buyers to pursue supplier diversification as a risk management strategy. Dependence on a single dominant supplier for a critical food commodity is a vulnerability. Buyers who experience disruption during periods of extreme concentration are now motivated to build more diversified supplier relationships even when the dominant supplier is not in active trade conflict. Canada is positioned to benefit from both of these dynamics. According to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Statistics Canada, Canada is a major exporter of wheat, canola, pulses, barley, and other grains and oilseeds. While Canada is not primarily a corn exporter at the scale of the United States, Canadian corn production, concentrated in Ontario and Quebec, has been growing, and Canada's broader grain and oilseed export capacity represents a significant alternative supply option for international buyers seeking to diversify away from American sources. According to the Canadian Grain Commission, which is the federal regulatory body responsible for establishing and maintaining grain quality standards in Canada, Canadian grain exports carry a quality assurance framework that is internationally recognized and commercially valued. The Canadian Grain Commission's grading and inspection system provides international buyers with confidence in the consistency and quality of Canadian grain, a reputational asset that supports Canada's competitive position in global markets. The federal government has been active in supporting Canadian agricultural export diversification. According to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Canada has pursued trade agreements and market access commitments specifically designed to open and expand export markets for Canadian agricultural producers. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as CPTPP, has opened preferential market access for Canadian agricultural products in Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, and other Asia-Pacific markets. The Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, provides similar preferential access in European markets. These agreements are not aspirational. They are in-force legal frameworks that provide Canadian exporters with commercial advantages over American competitors who do not have equivalent preferential access in the same markets. This is a structural competitive advantage that many Canadians do not fully appreciate. When American corn faces retaliatory tariffs in a market where Canadian grain enters under a preferential trade agreement, Canadian producers have a price advantage that is embedded in trade law, not dependent on commodity market fluctuations. The combination of retaliatory pressure on American exports and Canadian preferential access in the same markets creates a window of commercial opportunity that is real and actionable for Canadian producers right now. According to the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service, which is the federal agency that helps Canadian businesses access international markets, agricultural exporters have access to market intelligence, trade mission support, and in-market representation across Canada's priority export markets. For producers and agri-food companies looking to expand into markets where American competitors are facing new friction, these federal resources are directly relevant. Now let us talk about who is most directly affected by this agricultural trade shift. Because the economic geography of Canadian grain production means that the stakes are distributed unevenly across the country, and understanding who gains and who faces challenges is essential for an accurate picture. Saskatchewan is Canada's largest grain-producing province and the agricultural heartland of the country. According to Statistics Canada's crop production data, Saskatchewan accounts for the substantial majority of Canadian wheat, canola, and pulse production. Farmers in Saskatchewan are the primary beneficiaries of expanding global demand for Canadian grain. When international buyers shift procurement toward Canadian sources, Saskatchewan farm incomes are the first and most directly affected variable. Strong export demand supports commodity prices, which supports farm revenue, which flows through rural communities in the form of equipment purchases, service sector activity, and local tax revenue that funds schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Alberta and Manitoba are the other major grain-producing provinces with significant stakes in export market performance. Ontario's corn sector, which is Canada's primary corn-producing region, has a more direct interest in the specific dynamics of the global corn market and in any commercial opportunity created by friction in American corn exports. For Ontario corn farmers, a global market shift away from American corn is a specific, proximate opportunity rather than a general benefit from improved grain market conditions. For rural communities across the prairies and in Ontario's agricultural belt, farm income is not an abstract economic indicator. It is the foundation of local economic activity. When commodity prices are strong and export demand is high, farm equipment dealerships are busy, rural banks are lending, local businesses are hiring, and provincial tax revenues from agricultural activity support public services. The connection between global grain market dynamics and the economic health of rural Canadian communities is direct and consequential. For Canadian taxpayers, the federal government's investment in trade agreement negotiation, market access work, and agricultural support programs represents a public expenditure that is intended to generate exactly this kind of export market opportunity. The return on that investment, measured in farm income, rural economic activity, and export revenue, is the accountability standard against which agricultural trade policy should be assessed. For Canadian households, the connection between agricultural export performance and consumer food prices runs through the broader supply and demand dynamics of food commodity markets. Strong export demand can, under some conditions, support domestic commodity prices that feed through to retail food costs. However, Canada's domestic food price environment is shaped by many factors beyond grain export dynamics, including the Canadian dollar exchange rate, retail sector competition, and global commodity price trends. Canadians should understand this connection without overstating its directness or immediacy. For small and medium-sized agri-food businesses, grain handlers, processors, exporters, and food manufacturers, the current trade environment presents both opportunity and operational complexity. Businesses that can move quickly to establish or expand relationships in markets where American competitors are facing friction may capture commercial advantages that persist well beyond the current trade conflict. Businesses that are slower to adapt may find that competitors, both Canadian and international, have established relationships that are difficult to displace. For students and young people considering careers in agriculture, agri-food, or agricultural trade, the current environment underlines the long-term value of agricultural expertise, international trade knowledge, and food systems understanding. Canada's agricultural sector is a sophisticated, globally connected industry that requires skilled professionals across production, logistics, quality assurance, trade compliance, and market development. Federal and provincial agricultural education and skills programs are the pathways most directly relevant to career development in this sector. Now let us address the mistakes Canadians commonly make when they encounter headlines about agricultural trade shifts, because in this area, optimism about opportunity can obscure real challenges that deserve honest attention. The first mistake is assuming that global market shifts toward Canadian grain happen automatically and immediately. International procurement relationships take time to establish. Buyers need to verify quality standards, build logistics pathways, establish credit relationships, and navigate import regulatory requirements before new supply relationships become operationally active. The opportunity is real, but realizing it requires commercial work that does not happen overnight. The second mistake is treating all Canadian grain as a direct substitute for American corn. Different grains serve different end uses. Canadian wheat, canola, and pulses are not identical substitutes for American corn in every application. The opportunity for Canadian producers is genuine, but it is most directly relevant for producers growing commodities that can substitute for American products in specific end-use applications. And that substitutability varies by market and by use case. The third mistake is overlooking the infrastructure constraints that can limit Canada's ability to capture export opportunities quickly. Canadian grain export capacity, port facilities, rail transportation, grain handling infrastructure has finite throughput. Rapid increases in export demand can create congestion, delays, and cost pressures that partially offset the commercial benefits of improved market conditions. The federal government's agricultural infrastructure investments, including those supporting Prairie Rail and West Coast port capacity, are directly relevant to Canada's ability to capitalize on export market opportunities. The fourth mistake is ignoring the weather and production risk dimension of agricultural opportunity. Canada's ability to supply international markets depends on crop production, which depends on growing conditions that can vary significantly from year to year. The opportunity created by global market shifts toward Canadian grain is only as valuable as Canada's actual production capacity in any given year. Federal crop insurance programs, administered through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in partnership with provincial governments, are the primary risk management tools available to Canadian producers managing production uncertainty. Here is your verified action checklist for staying accurately informed on this story. Visit Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada through canada.dca for authoritative information on Canadian agricultural production, export data, trade agreements, and federal support programs for Canadian farmers and agri-food businesses. Check the Canadian Grain Commission at grainscanada.gc.ca for information on Canadian grain quality standards, export inspection, and the regulatory framework that supports Canada's international grain trade reputation. Visit the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service at tradecommissioner.gcc.ca for market intelligence, international trade support resources, and information on federal programs available to agricultural exporters seeking to expand into new markets. Follow Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's market access updates for the latest information on trade agreement implementation, market access developments, and any changes to export conditions in specific markets. Review statistics. Canada's agricultural statistics publications for current data on Canadian crop production, export volumes, and commodity price trends. These are publicly available and provide the factual foundation for understanding where Canadian agriculture stands in global markets. If you are a farmer or agri-food business, contact your provincial agricultural ministry and your commodity organization for province-specific information on programs, market development support, and risk management tools relevant to your operation. Drop a comment below with your province. If you farm, work in agricultural supply chains, or live in a rural community whose economy depends on agricultural prosperity, tell us how this trade environment is affecting you. Are you seeing new market interest from international buyers? Are infrastructure constraints limiting your ability to capitalize? Are federal support programs reaching you effectively? We read every comment and your perspective matters. Here is your rapid recap. Global trade friction affecting American agricultural exports, including retaliatory tariffs on American corn and grain products in markets responding to American trade actions, is creating commercial opportunity for Canadian agricultural exporters. Canada's in-force trade agreements, including CPTPP and CETA, provide Canadian producers with preferential market access in key markets where American competitors face new trade barriers. The Canadian Grain Commission's Quality Assurance Framework supports Canada's competitive reputation in international markets. Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario are the provinces most directly positioned to benefit from expanded export demand. Infrastructure capacity, production risk, and the time required to build new commercial relationships are real constraints on how quickly and completely Canada can capture this opportunity. Federal support through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the Trade Commissioner Service, and agricultural risk management programs is the practical toolkit available to Canadian producers right now. The open question this story leaves us with is whether Canada's agricultural sector, its farmers, its exporters, its infrastructure operators, and its federal and provincial governments will move with sufficient speed and coordination to convert this window of opportunity into lasting market relationships. Windows open and windows close. The Canadian agricultural sector has the quality, the reputation, and the trade framework it needs. Whether it has the speed and the coordination to fully capitalize is the question that the coming months will answer. Maple Wire will continue tracking this file. Subscribe so you get the update when it matters. Like this video if it gave you a complete and honest picture of what this agricultural trade shift actually means for Canada. Share it with family and friends, particularly anyone in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, or Ontario with a stake in Canadian farm income and rural economic health. Send it on WhatsApp to anyone asking what Canada's agricultural opportunity in the current trade environment really looks like. All official source links are in the description below. Stay informed, verify everything, and we will see you in the next update.